Section number 18 of Library Essays, Papers Related to the Work of Public Libraries. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Sandy. Library Essays, Papers Related to the Work of Public Libraries by Arthur Elmore Bostwick. Service Systems in Libraries. I should be understood better, perhaps, if I said civil service in the library, but the civil service is so called merely in distinction to the military service, and there can be no military service in the library, although the uniform of certain janitors and messengers may appear at first sight to give me the lie. Every library, of course, must have some plan of service, more or less systematic. This may or may not be subject to the regulations of the state or city civil service. I have no desire to dwell here on the question of the desirability of such a connection, but I cannot refrain from saying, at the risk of losing all of my civil service reform friends, that I regard the present methods of bringing about appointment for merit only as makeshifts, well designed to defeat the efforts of politicians and others who wish to see the appointments made for other reasons, but necessary only so long as those efforts are likely to continue. I shall doubtless be told that they are likely to continue indefinitely, and therefore that I have given away my whole case. To show that this is not so, we have only to point to a large number of libraries in connection with which there is no such effort, and in which safeguards against it are absolutely unnecessary. I do not know why politics has not invaded these institutions, but I know that it has not. During the past 16 years, I have been connected with 4 large libraries, and I am in a position to say not only that no political appointment was made in them during my connection, but that no such appointment was ever attempted or suggested. There is absolutely no reason why the protection of civil service regulation should be thrown over these libraries, and every reason why they should be free from the harassing and embarrassing petty annoyances and restrictions that are inseparable from such regulation. Much as I honor the advocates of civil service reform, and applaud what they have accomplished in the way of furthering a real merit system, I submit that a further step in advance may be taken when we have heads of municipal departments as unlikely to make political appointments as the average librarian is, and as free from pressure to make such appointments as are the librarians of a large number of our best institutions. I regard that as the best system, therefore, in which an appointing officer or body, sincerely desirous of making appointments for merit only, is perfectly free to make such appointments in any way that seems proper, and as the only second best system that in which the appointing power, unwilling to make appointments for merit, is forced to do so, as far as may be, by the supervision and control of a body created for the purpose. So long as we have unwilling municipal officers, we must endure the second best plan, of course, but librarians are rarely of this kind, though they may be unfortunately in the power of those who are. It has been my good fortune to formulate a scheme of service for each of the 4 libraries to which I have referred, and these schemes, with necessary modifications, are still in satisfactory use. The first, for the New York Free Circulating Library, was made in 1896. The last for the St. Louis Public Library in 1910. Some were hampered by the necessity of adapting them to municipal regulation, while others were quite free, and other local conditions imposed differences upon them, but they depended in the main on the same principles and were carried out in much the same way. I have numerous requests for information on this subject and for advice upon methods of grading library staffs, with regulation of promotions, increases of salary, etc. Possibly the best way to answer these may be to give a brief account of the way in which the work was done in these 4 cases. It has been assumed by some that as every good librarian desires to have these matters systematically regulated, regulation by a city civil service commission will be as good as any, and that a man who wishes to have a system of his own and keep it under his own control is unreasonable and foolish. A non-professional body, however, cannot, even with professional expert advice, satisfactorily regulate the employment of professionals for professional work. This point has been so often insisted upon and elaborated that those who do not now appreciate its validity will never do so. Every good librarian will wish to create machinery to put the right man in the right place in his force and to drop him out if he goes wrong, but it must be his own machinery, not that of someone else, and must be designed to aid him, not to hamper him. My attention was drawn to the necessity of a more systematic plan of service in the New York Free Circulating Library on assuming charge in 1895. The library had been hampered by insufficiency of funds and had been obliged to supplement assistants of ability and experience with others who had been employed simply because they could be obtained at low salaries. Promotion where it was distinctly indicated was for merit, ascertained simply by the librarian's opinion, and salary increases were made very largely for length of service. An effort was made at the outset to regulate admission to the force and advancement within it. The features of examination and of grade distinguished by letters were borrowed from the Boston Public Library. A department head, who had been giving private instruction, had by the board's permission placed some of her pupils in the library for practice work. This seemed an excellent opportunity to train future assistants, so the private class was turned into a library training class and the pupils into apprentices, their teacher being retained as such and properly compensated. The library force was divided into 3 grades, A, B, and C, to which a 4th D was afterwards added. The first 2 were indicated by the fact that the library consisted of 6 coordinate branches, each with its librarian in charge and her first assistant. All the former were graded as A, and the latter as B. Class A thus necessarily became limited in number depending on the number of branches, and B would have been similarly limited if it had not been made to include also all the high-grade assistants, all capable of assignment at any time to the work of a deputy librarian of a branch. Class C was then a remainder class, including all other members of the library staff. It soon appeared, however, that the line of demarcation between those members of Class B who were first assistant librarians and those who were not was much more distinct than that between B and C. B was accordingly limited to first assistants, the remnant was called C, and the old C became D. The old feeling that seniority should be considered was deferred to by arranging for automatic increases of salary within the grades at specified intervals. Janitors and messengers remained quite outside this arrangement. It was provided that no one should be promoted from grade to grade without the passage of an examination, but that passage simply placed the successful candidate on a list of eligibles, and promotion from this list was made by considering personal fitness, character of work, and immediate conditions. Qualifications for the different grades differed, but in quantity and advancement, rather than in quality, all coming under the heads of literature, language, general information, and library economy. This plan was formulated in consultation with the library committee and was adopted as part of the rules of the library by the board. The committee differed somewhat on the seniority increases within grades, which were finally retained, and considered it of great importance to emphasize work and personal fitness. Methods of including marks for these in the final standing of the candidate were considered, but the difficulty of doing so led to the adoption of the plan as stated. It was decided to give every member of the staff the right to demand an examination for promotion on the expiration of 3 years' service in one grade, and to admit others by special order. Advancement proved to be necessarily so rapid, however, that no one who had any chance of passing the examination ever remained 3 years in a grade, and this clause proved practically inoperative. Of course, many passed and were placed on the eligible list for promotion who had no chance of advancement for reasons connected to the work or personality. This caused dissatisfaction, which it was sought to mitigate by recognizing presence on the eligible list by increase of salary to the grade limit, provided this had not been already attained. Even so, however, it continued to exist. The alternative was considered of examining only those selected for promotion and of making promotion conditional on the passage of such examination, but was rejected, although a perfectly possible and logical plan. But objectionable in many ways, as all examinations are, they foster a feeling that everyone is having a chance, and a previous selection, no matter how good, is open to the same objection as the selection alone would be without any test at all. It would also have been possible to make the examination competitive, placing the names on the list in the order of passage and promoting in that order, or grading the names in order of seniority, as in most city systems. But both these plans are open to obvious objections, and I still think it is best to form an eligible list, whose names shall not be considered in any order at all, the appointing officer being quite free to make his choice among them. The application of the system of grading to the staff, as it existed, involved discrimination at only one point, that separating classes B and C, or as renamed later C and D. The line was drawn partly on the basis of the salary list as it stood, and partly by duties, and there was little dissatisfaction. I have said that this system was formally adopted by the board. This is not necessary, nor is it the best plan. A system of this kind is best regarded simply as an aid to the librarian in making recommendations for appointment or promotion. In making such recommendation, the librarian must, of course, satisfy himself that his candidates are fit, and it is proper that he should adopt any system that commends itself to him for ascertaining that they are so. The board is, of course, the final authority. It could override any system that it might adopt just as easily as it could go over the head of the librarian's recommendation, and it is better for its own dignity that a departure from the system should take the latter form rather than the former. I regard it as quite sufficient, therefore, when a librarian grades his staff, that he should simply report to his board that he is about to make certain dispositions and requires certain tests to aid him in making proper recommendations for appointment and promotion, and that his recommendations in future will be guided by these arrangements. The authority of the board and its ability to reject his recommendations have not been touched, and its disposition to trust him and accept his advice will be surely increased as it sees that he is adopting plans to improve that advice and give it force. This grading of the New York Free circulating staff has been dwelt on at length, although very simple, because it formed the basis of other gradings now to be described. The application of a similar system to the staff of the Brooklyn Public Library took place early in 1899, at a time when, owing to a crisis in the affairs of the library, it had temporarily ceased to do work. It had only 4 library assistants, and yet the probabilities were strongly in favor of an immediate and rapid expansion, such as actually did take place not long after. Expediency, therefore, pointed to the organization of the staff on the supposition that it would soon be of considerable size. The grading was precisely similar to that described, except that classes C and D were combined and called Class C, and the letter D was used to designate members of the training class. The principal interest in the scheme as then adopted lies in its relations with the city civil service. The New York Free Circulating Library was a private institution, charitable in its origin, but broadening rapidly out into real public work. It had no relation with the city except to apply annually for its subsidy and receipt for the monthly installments thereof as paid over. There could be no question, therefore, of city civil service jurisdiction. The case in Brooklyn was different. The members of the board were appointed by the mayor, and the library was recognized as a city institution, although exactly what this means had not yet been definitely determined. The scheme of service was adopted at first on the supposition that the board was to be as free in the matter as though it had been an entirely independent body. The question might never have arisen, but was precipitated by the city auditors holding up the payroll on the ground that it had not been certified by the Municipal Civil Service Commission. The question went at once to the Corporation Council for an opinion, and after he had decided that the city civil service regulations covered the library force, there was a further dispute with the State Civil Service Commission, exacerbated by a difference in political complexion between the two bodies. This held up the payroll for some time and did not tend to reconcile any member of the staff to its new status. Matters having been settled, the commission promptly certified the payroll as it stood in order to terminate the embarrassing situation, and then ensued a series of conferences with the librarian on permanent grading. It was decided that the librarian and assistant librarian fell within the exempt class, and that other members of the staff could be divided into senior and junior assistants, the latter including only members of the training class until properly appointed to permanent positions. Whatever grading the library might choose to make within the senior assistant class, A, B, and C, was therefore its own affair, the commission taking cognizance of it only so far as it involved increase of salary. The point of conflict came at the entrance to Class C, or on appointment to permanent position at the library. The commission at first insisted that it should make its own eligible list, graded in accordance with its own examinations, although it agreed to admit no others except members of the training class to such examinations. At least one examination of the kind was held, the questions evidently being written by some outside librarian on general principles and with little reference to our needs and conditions. Ultimately, however, the commission agreed to let us hold the examinations and to accept our rating, although, when the eligible list had once been formed, we were bound by it rigidly. In regard to persons outside our graded force, such as janitors and messengers, we were held strictly to civil service rules, selecting our men from the first 3 on the list submitted to us by the commission. An unsatisfactory person could be summarily rejected after trial for a specified period, and as many such were on the list, there was rapid rotation in office in this part of the force, and the graded staff also, although it might seem that the commission had almost abdicated its powers in our favor, we felt the restriction that bound us to select from the top of the list. Even though we had originally made the ratings, it often happened that for the particular vacancy in question, the sixth name might be that of the best qualified person, and we had the disagreeable alternative of taking one who was not our first choice, or of appointing on trial and rejecting until the proper name had been reached, a process much in vogue in city departments, but tiresome to the appointing authority and ignominious to those who were thus rejected and who might be better qualified than the person desired for another kind of position. In 1901, the New York Free Circulating Library became the circulation department of the New York Public Library under circumstances that gave it a separate governing body responsible to the trustees of the public library and a separate staff whose organization was not necessarily the same as that of the reference staff. The annexed staff, of course, brought its own organization with it, and this, with some modifications, became that of the present circulation department. The principal changes were the limitation of Class C to 3 times the number of branch libraries and the almost total abolition of salary increases for length of service within grades. The former prevented unlimited promotion from D to C and made necessary a selection from the waiting list to fill actual vacancies, and the latter, while not doing away with the difference of salaries in the same grade, made it possible to give the increases as a reward for good work. The designation of the grades by letters was objected to by some members of the board, on the ground that it meant nothing, so that the alternative names were adopted for C, D, and E, the 2 upper grades having already the names of librarian in charge and first assistant. Members of C were named second assistant librarians, D assistants, and E attendants. When the free circulating library grading was made, there were neither children's rooms nor children's librarians in New York, and very few anywhere. The former arose first and were served by persons assigned for the purpose, usually from grade C. The organization later of a separate children's department with jurisdiction over all children's rooms made it necessary to place children's librarians in a separate class, but that they might not feel out of the running for branch librarianships, they were allowed to take examinations and advance from one regular grade to another in addition if they so desired. Catalogers were still graded regularly, however, although these might have been easily treated in a similar way. The special nature of their work, however, was recognized by a variation in the examination. The test for the children's grade was not an examination, but a series of periods of practical work in selected branch libraries with observation and report and a final thesis. Candidates were specially selected by the supervisor of children's work, and so jealously has entrance into this grade been guarded that even now not more than half of the 40 or more assistants in charge of the New York's children's rooms are members of it. In later years, a thesis also has formed part of the examination for Class A. This is written on an assigned subject, and the successful ones are sometimes, although not always, printed. One of the difficulties connected with the grading in the circulation department of the New York Public Library was the assignment of proper grades of the staffs of different institutions that consolidated with that library from time to time. There were altogether about half a dozen of these, with staffs varying in number perhaps from 5 to 40 or 50 persons. It was decided to leave the assignment entirely to the authorities of these libraries, who practically graded their staffs on a plan corresponding with ours before consolidation, so that there was no change of grade afterward. The responsibility was thus thrown onto bodies of men with whose authority the new staffs were familiar, and which they would be inclined to accept. The assignments were made with varying degrees of care and validity, but were on the whole just, and there was little complaint with them. Too low an assignment was corrected by the next examinations for promotion, and a person graded too high never at all events rose any higher. The smoothness with which these consolidations took place, even sometimes against the will and with the dismal foreboding of the dispossessed authorities, and the rapidity with which the entire staff became homogeneous, both in feeling and in quality of work, are sufficient justification of this particular policy, which was typical of that of the library in regard to other features of these consolidations. In the year 1910, it was decided to grade the staff of the St. Louis Public Library. The principal differences between the problem here and that in the cases that have been described depended on the fact that this was an old library, with a comparatively large staff, having traditions of its own and justly proud of its achievements and of its library reputation. There had even been a feeling at some time in the past on the part of some members of the board that a graded staff was not a good thing, as it would hamper freedom of control. The staff, however, had reached such a size that some kind of classification appeared inevitable, and the proper method of handling it seemed to be that indicated above as preferable, namely, as purely an administrative matter under the librarian's control, to aid him in making recommendations for appointment, promotion, and increase of salary. This was explained to the board, and there being no objection, a notice was at once inserted in staff notes. The medium of communication between the librarian and the staff, that the force would be shortly divided into grades, the object being to represent definitely the exact position occupied by each one, and to affix the maximum salary belonging to each grade. There was some additional preliminary explanation and a request for suggestions and opinions. After a lapse of about 6 months, during which the plan became familiar to all by discussion, both informal and in the weekly meetings of the heads of departments, the grading was announced by the publication in staff notes of all the principles on which it was being made, with explanations in considerable detail. The names of those assigned to the different grades were not given, but each member of the staff was notified separately of his own grading unless this was obvious from the published explanation, as in the case of branch librarians. It was announced that the grading was not an act of the board, but simply a schedule expressing the former manner in which recommendations will hereafter be made to the board. This scheme was more thoroughgoing than any of those previously noted in that it provided a place and designation for everyone in the library's employ. The force was divided into 3 sections: regular grades, special grades, and ungraded occupations. The former were classified practically as in New York. The special grades were made to include catalogers and children's librarians, with any special positions of enough importance to be placed there. The ungraded occupations were those of janitors and their assistants, messengers, elevator men, binders, and other miscellaneous employees. In the regular grades, A and B were limited, and while C and D were not formally so, it was announced that they would not be indefinitely increased. It was provided that those in special grades might qualify also for regular grades, and might also be transferred thereto if desired. An assignment of members of the staff to grades, existing conditions were recognized as far as possible, with no immediate attempt to remedy faults that might exist therein. Statement was made that all persons who might consider themselves wrongly graded would have early opportunity to show their fitness for the grade above, either in the regular way or in some other, if it could be devised. It was stated that the qualifications that would gain the librarian's recommendation for promotion from grade to grade, which it will be remembered consists merely of an increase of salary, so far as the board takes cognizance thereof, would in general be of 3 kinds: educational, to be ascertained by certificate or diploma, or failing these, by examination; special, to be ascertained in some cases by examination, in others by mail, in others by certified experience; and personal, to be ascertained by personal knowledge. In connection with the scheme, the training class was much extended in scope and its course broadened and made to cover an educational year. Here, as in New York, the scheme is entirely distinct from the municipal civil service, but for a different reason. In New York, the library is a private institution occupying city property and doing public work by provision of a contract which does not provide for extension of the city civil service rules over the library force. In St. Louis, the merit system has not been introduced at all among city employees. Should it be introduced in the future, and should it be decided that the members of the library staff are strictly employees of the city, we might have here the Brooklyn experience over again, as detailed above. For purely selfish reasons, therefore, the St. Louis Public Library should be well satisfied with the status quo. In concluding, it may be well to call attention again to the fact that such schemes as these are designed to aid an appointing body or officer, not to control him. They would be of little value to a municipality desiring to limit a political mayor's power for evil, or to a mayor wishing to keep his board of library trustees within bounds, or to a board anxious to curb its librarians' propensity to appoint personal favorites. Such a plan presupposes that appointment and promotion for the good of the service are desired, and it serves to bring this about so far as it may. A board or a librarian could depart from it or violate its provisions in a dozen ways. What then is the use of it? In a small staff it has no uses. It would be as silly to grade such a staff and make rules for its promotion as it would be for a housekeeper with a cook and one maid to call the former class A and the latter class B, and draw up rules for their appointment and promotion. But as soon as the size of the staff exceeds that at which the officer in charge can know each member and her work with intimate personal knowledge, then something of the kind becomes imperative. The members of such a staff are better satisfied that they are being treated with uniform justice and that merit is properly recognized, If it is done in some systematic way like this, and the officer on whose recommendation appointments and promotions are made runs much less risk of making mistakes. Every librarian should, I believe, examine himself to make sure that his present scheme of service, whatever it may be, is sufficient for these purposes and adapted to secure their attainment smoothly and satisfactorily. End of section 18.